Picture this. You're standing before the remnants of Hadrian's Wall, that iconic stone barrier stretching across the wild north of England. For generations, this incredible structure has stood as a symbol of Roman power in Britain, a fixed frontier, a statement of imperial control. It's a familiar image, one that anchors our entire understanding of Roman Britain as a land of legions, orderly towns, and a civilization imposed upon an ancient landscape. But what if that powerful, enduring image is not the whole truth? What if the history we've all learned, the story set in stone, is suddenly, dramatically changing? Because right now, a groundbreaking new discovery is turning everything we thought we knew upside down, forcing historians to completely rewrite the narrative of Rome's presence on this island. This isn't just a small footnote or a minor adjustment. We are talking about a seismic shift in our interpretation of the past, a genuine historical earthquake that challenges the very foundations of Roman-British history. For so long, our view has been built on the grand monuments, the writings of Roman historians, the forts and the roads. But now a team of archaeologists has unearthed something so unexpected, so contradictory to the established story, that it's making us question the entire timeline and nature of Rome's relationship with Britain. It's the kind of find that every historian dreams of, a piece of evidence that doesn't just add to the puzzle, but forces you to take the entire puzzle apart and start all over again. The old certainties are crumbling, and a new, more complex and far more fascinating story is beginning to emerge from the earth. So join us on a journey of historical detective work, an exploration into a past that is being reinvented before our very eyes. We are about to pull back the curtain on a discovery that rewrites the rules and redefines an empire's legacy. This is more than just archaeology. It's a thrilling intellectual adventure, one that connects us directly with the lives, the struggles, and the untold stories of those who lived nearly 2,000 years ago. Prepare to see Roman Britain in a whole new light, because what we're about to uncover doesn't just change the history book. It changes how we see one of the most famous empires the world has ever known. To truly grasp the magnitude of this new discovery, we first need to understand the established story it's challenging. For generations, the history of Roman Britain has been told as a linear, almost predictable epic. It's a tale that begins officially in the year 43 AD, when the Emperor Claudius, seeking a military triumph to solidify his power, launched a full-scale invasion across the English Channel. Roman legions landed on the shores of Kent, and through superior discipline and organization, they began a methodical conquest of the southern half of the island. We were taught about key battles, the subjugation of local tribes, and the establishment of a new provincial capital at Londinium. This narrative then fast-forwards a couple of decades to the Great Rebellion led by Queen Boudica, a fiery, tragic clash that saw the destruction of several Roman towns before being brutally suppressed, seemingly cementing Roman authority. The story continues with the consolidation of power, moving north into what is now Scotland. This is where the iconic image of Hadrian's Wall enters the picture, constructed beginning in the year 122 AD. In the traditional view, this massive wall wasn't just a defensive fortification. It was a powerful psychological and political statement. It represented the absolute limit of the Roman world, a permanent frontier separating civilization from the barbarian wilds beyond. For the next 250 years, the textbook narrative goes, Britain was Roman. The legions manned the forts, a network of straight roads connected new towns, and a colonial elite enjoyed villas with heated floors and mosaics, while the local population was gradually, and often forcibly, Romanized. This entire era was framed as a distinct period, a chapter with a clear beginning and a definitive end. That end came in the early 5th century AD, as the Western Roman Empire strained under immense pressure, recalling its legions to defend the heartland. The standard history books describe a rather abrupt withdrawal, where the Roman administration packed up and left. The lights of civilization effectively switched off, leaving a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by Anglo-Saxon settlers. This entire framework invasion, consolidation, a golden age of provincial life, and then withdrawal painted Roman Britain in very clear, bold colors. It was presented as the ultimate frontier story, a classic example of an advanced empire imposing its will on a foreign land, a narrative that was clean, understandable, and, as we are now learning, profoundly incomplete. This was the comfortable, established baseline, the foundation upon which centuries of scholarship were built. It all started not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet, methodical rhythm of an archaeological evaluation. In a tranquil field in rural Northamptonshire, a place more known for its rolling hills and farming than for rewriting history, a team was conducting a routine survey ahead of a planned new road. These kinds of investigations are standard practice across Britain. A last look into the soil before modern development forever changes the landscape. The archaeologists were digging a series of trial trenches, carefully slicing through the layers of earth, expecting perhaps to find the faint traces of a medieval farmstead or the remains of an Iron Age roundhouse, the kind of local history that fills county archives but rarely makes national headlines. The initial signs were subtle, almost easy to miss. It began with the soil itself. As they dug deeper, they noticed a distinct, dark stain in the otherwise natural yellow clay, the unmistakable signature of an ancient ditch or pit that had long since filled with organic matter. This was promising, but not yet extraordinary. The real mystery started to unfold when they began sifting through the dirt from that feature. Among the first finds were fragments of pottery, the broken pieces of everyday life from centuries past. At a glance, some of the sherds looked familiar, the coarse, gritty fabric of local Iron Age wear, typical of the communities that lived here before the Romans arrived. But mixed in were other pieces that made the archaeologists pause. These were finer, with a distinctive red gloss and elegant, thin-walled forms. They were Samian ware, a high-status pottery famously imported from Roman Gaul. Finding Roman pottery in Britain is not unusual. Finding it in the same context, the very same soil layer, as pre-Roman Iron Age pottery, is a chronological red flag. According to the established timeline, these two types of material should not be co-mingling. It suggested these two distinct cultures, one native and one Roman, were existing side by side at a time when they supposedly weren't. But the plot was about to thicken considerably. As the team expanded their excavation, they uncovered the post holes of a large structure. The pattern of these dark, circular stains in the earth revealed the outline of a substantial rectangular building, a style completely alien to the native British roundhouses. This was a Roman-style structure with a very specific architectural footprint. Then came the small finds, a bronze coin, worn almost smooth but just legible enough to be identified. It wasn't from the era of Claudius's invasion in 43 AD. It was older, much older. It dated to the reign of the Emperor Augustus, decades before the official invasion was even supposed to have happened. Here was physical, undeniable proof of a Roman presence, not just a trade good that could have been passed from hand to hand, but evidence of people living on this very spot, building in a Roman fashion, at a time when history insists the Romans had no formal foothold in Britain at all. This was no longer just an anomaly. It was a direct challenge to the history books, buried for 2 millennia under an English field. So what exactly did they uncover that has caused such an uproar among historians? When we hear about a groundbreaking archaeological find, our minds often jump to images of glittering treasure chests or a lone, spectacular artifact like a lost statue or a golden mask. But the true revolution here is far more profound and in many ways more telling. This wasn't a hidden hoard of coins or a single inscribed stone. Instead, the team slowly unearthed the ghostly imprint of an entire community, a sprawling settlement that simply should not have been there. As they meticulously peeled back the layers, the full scope of the site began to emerge, revealing not a small trading post or a temporary camp, but a large, well-organized and surprisingly permanent Roman complex that was already thriving decades before Emperor Claudius ever set his sights on Britain. We're looking at the foundations of multiple Roman-style buildings, arranged in a deliberate, orderly fashion along what appears to be a main street. These weren't flimsy huts. They were substantial structures built using Roman techniques, with deep foundations and post holes indicating framed buildings that were meant to last. The artifacts pulled from the soil around these buildings paint a vivid picture of daily life. There were not just a few scattered pieces of imported pottery, but a massive quantity of it, amphorae that once held olive oil and wine from the Mediterranean, fine tableware from Gaul, and even fragments of glass vessels. This isn't the kind of material that comes from occasional trade with the local Britons. This is the household debris of people who are living a Roman lifestyle, with Roman tastes and access to Roman supply chains, on a scale that suggests a sustained and significant population. Perhaps most startlingly, the excavation revealed features that point toward a military or administrative presence. They found the remains of what looks like a principia, the headquarters building that was the central command post in any Roman fort or fortified town. They uncovered a horium, a granary built with the distinct raised floors the Romans used to store grain and keep it dry. This is the architecture of occupation and long-term planning, not casual exploration or simple diplomacy. The coin evidence further tightens the chronological vise. Multiple coins have been identified, with the earliest minted during the reign of Augustus, who died in the year 14 AD. That places this community's heyday a full generation, perhaps even two, before the year 43. This site wasn't just occupied for a season. The mix of coins and pottery styles shows it was active for 30 or 40 years. A fully functioning Roman settlement on British soil, a full generation before the history books say the Romans had any serious interest in being here. Of course, a discovery this radical, one that so blatantly contradicts the established historical record, requires more than just compelling artifacts. It demands bulletproof, scientific proof. The artifacts alone told a story that seemed impossible, so the team turned to a suite of cutting-edge dating techniques to put their extraordinary claims to the ultimate test. They needed to move beyond interpretation and into the realm of verifiable fact, to pin down the exact years this settlement was active with a level of precision that would silence any skeptics. This is where the real detective work began, using the very atoms in the soil and the rings in ancient wood to build an unassailable case for a new timeline. First, let's talk about radiocarbon dating, a method most of us have heard of but might not fully understand. It's not magic, it's atomic clockwork. All living things absorb carbon from the atmosphere, including a tiny, constant fraction of a radioactive isotope called carbon-14. When a plant or animal dies, it stops absorbing new carbon, and that stored carbon-14 begins to decay at a steady, predictable rate. By measuring how much is left in a sample like a charred grain of wheat, an animal bone from a meal, or a piece of charcoal from a cooking fire, scientists can calculate how long ago that organism died. The team collected dozens of these organic samples from the very bottom of the ditches and the foundation layers of the buildings, ensuring they were dating the moment the site was first constructed and used. When the results came back from the lab, they were unequivocal. The carbon-14 dates consistently pointed to a window between the late 1st century BC and the early 1st century AD. This wasn't a single fluke measurement. It was a consistent signal across multiple samples, providing a powerful statistical anchor for the site's earliest occupation. But the team went further, employing a method that is even more precise than radiocarbon dating: dendrochronology, or tree ring dating. Incredibly, preserved in the waterlogged conditions at the bottom of an ancient well, they found several large structural timbers. To an archaeologist, this is like finding a time capsule with the dates stamped on it. By carefully analyzing the pattern of wide and narrow rings in the wood patterns created by years of good and bad growing conditions, specialists can match that unique sequence to a master chronology, a year-by-year calendar for trees that stretches back thousands of years. It's like a barcode. When they matched the sequence from one of the main foundation timbers, they could pinpoint the exact year the tree was cut down. The result was staggering. That tree was felled in the autumn of 15 BC. Think about that for a moment. This places skilled, organized Roman construction work in the heart of Britain during the reign of Emperor Augustus, a full 6 decades before the Claudian invasion. Finally, to seal the case, they used a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, which dates the last time a grain of sand was exposed to sunlight. It works on the very soil the buildings were constructed on. When minerals like quartz are buried, they accumulate natural radiation from the surrounding environment. Exposure to sunlight resets this signal to zero. By measuring the amount of energy trapped in these buried minerals, scientists can determine how long they have been sitting in the dark. The OSL dating was applied to the foundation layers and the soil directly beneath the earliest road surfaces. The results came back in perfect, breathtaking harmony with the other methods, confirming that these earthworks were indeed created in that crucial period around the turn of the millennium. It was this convergence of evidence, the atomic decay, the tree rings, and the trapped sunlight, that created an irrefutable scientific trifecta. 3 independent clocks, all ticking in different ways, all stopped at the same startling moment in time. This scientific consensus didn't just suggest an earlier date. It completely demolished the old chronology, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that a significant Roman presence was firmly established in Britain generations before the history books said it was even possible. This discovery fundamentally shatters the cornerstone date of 43 AD, forcing us to rethink not just a single event, but the entire nature of Rome's relationship with Britain. If a settlement of this size and complexity was already thriving 60 years before Claudius's legions landed, then the official invasion can no longer be seen as a beginning. Instead, it starts to look more like a culmination, a formalization of a process that had been underway for generations. The traditional narrative of a single definitive conquest is replaced by a much messier, more drawn out, and far more interesting story of gradual entanglement. So if 43 AD wasn't the start, when did it actually begin? The evidence from Northamptonshire points our fingers directly back to the era of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and even beyond him to the legendary Julius Caesar. We have to remember that Caesar himself led 2 military expeditions to Britain's shores in 55 and 54 BC. The classical historians, like Caesar writing in his own Gallic Wars, presented these as reconnaissance enforce missions, quick raids to punish British tribes for aiding their Gallic cousins across the Channel. For a long time, modern historians largely took this at face value, viewing them as brief, ultimately unsuccessful forays that had no lasting impact. But the existence of a permanent settlement, just a few decades later, forces us to radically reinterpret Caesar's accounts. What if his missions were far more significant than he let on? It's possible he drastically downplayed his own failures or his ambitions. His incursions may have successfully established client kingdoms or powerful diplomatic ties with certain tribes, creating a network of Roman-friendly allies on the island. This new settlement could very well be the physical manifestation of that policy, a direct result of treaties and agreements forged not by Claudius, but by Caesar himself a full century earlier. This brings us to the long, transformative reign of Augustus. The scientific dating from the site places its peak activity squarely in his era, from around 15 BC onward. Augustus, who famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, was consolidating the empire, securing its frontiers, and projecting Roman power in new, sophisticated ways. The old idea that he simply abandoned any interest in Britain after Caesar's expeditions now seems completely untenable. The evidence on the ground suggests a sustained and systematic effort at colonization. This wasn't just traders occasionally sailing across the Channel to barter for British metals and hunting dogs. This was a planned, state-supported venture. The presence of a granary and a potential headquarters building indicates an official, organized operation, likely staffed by retired soldiers, Roman administrators, and their families. A deliberate planting of a Roman community deep in the British countryside to manage resources, influence local politics, and serve as a permanent listening post. Think of it not as an invasion with trumpets and marching legions, but as a slow, creeping osmosis. Roman influence was seeping into Britain through multiple channels long before the military officially arrived. This settlement would have been a hub of that activity. From this inland base, Roman agents could have been negotiating for the rich mineral resources of Britain: tin, lead, and iron. They would have been introducing Roman goods, Roman currency, and Roman building techniques, creating a local elite dependent on Roman trade and patronage. This process of creating a client state, of making the local power structures reliant on Rome, is a classic imperial strategy. By the time Claudius decided to launch his full-scale invasion, many of the southern British tribes may have already been so thoroughly entangled economically and politically with Rome that the conquest was, in some regions, less a violent takeover and more a simple changing of the administrative guard. The Claudian invasion then becomes the moment when Rome decided to cut out the middlemen and impose direct taxation and rule, precisely because the groundwork had been so thoroughly laid for decades. The real story is no longer a single date in 43, but a century-long shadow of influence that slowly fell across the island, making the official invasion almost inevitable. So who were these people, living in a bustling Roman-style settlement decades before the empire officially claimed this land? Unraveling their identities is like piecing together a historical mystery. Because they operated in the shadows of the official record, their stories largely erased by the later, grand narrative of conquest. The traditional image of the Roman arrival is one of overwhelming, organized force legions marching in perfect formation, engineers laying out straight roads, and governors issuing decrees. It's a top-down story of imperial power, clean and authoritative, but the community at Northamptonshire suggests a reality that was far more chaotic, entrepreneurial, and human. These weren't the faceless soldiers of a state-sponsored invasion. They were likely a mix of adventurers, outcasts, and opportunists, each with their own reasons for risking everything on a frontier beyond the empire's official border. Let's start with the most obvious candidates: traders and merchants, the sheer volume of imported goods found at the site. The wine amphorae, the fine Gallic tableware, speaks to a thriving commercial heart. But these weren't just simple shopkeepers. Imagine ambitious Roman businessmen who saw a golden opportunity in Britain's untapped resources. They would have been dealing in high-value commodities, British hunting dogs prized in Roman arenas, vast quantities of grain to feed the armies in Gaul, and most lucratively, metals. Britain was rich in tin, copper, lead, and iron. A savvy entrepreneur could make a fortune by establishing a direct supply line, cutting out the complex chain of middlemen that traditionally moved these goods across the Channel. This settlement, positioned inland, would have been a perfect base for negotiating directly with local chieftains, organizing the transport of goods, and warehousing them before the journey to the coast. These men were the frontier capitalists of their day, operating in a legal grey area where immense risk could yield immense reward. Then there are the mercenaries and the political exiles. The Roman world was constantly simmering with political intrigue and civil war. In the volatile period following the assassinations of Caesar and the rise of Augustus, many former soldiers found themselves on the losing side of a power struggle. For these battle-hardened veterans, Britain could have been a perfect refuge, a place far from the reach of the new emperor's vengeance. Their military skills would have been a valuable commodity to local British kings, who were constantly warring with each other. A rogue Roman centurion, offering to train a tribal war band in Roman drill and tactics, could easily become a powerful and wealthy figure in his own right. The potential military structures at the site hint at this possibility. This might not have been an official Roman fort, but a private compound for a band of armed, professional Romans selling their services to the highest bidder, effectively creating their own personal fiefdom in the British wilds. We also cannot discount the possibility of unofficial state sponsorship, what we might think of as a proto-colonial company. Augustus himself, while publicly focusing on consolidating the empire's continental borders, may have quietly encouraged such ventures. Sending groups of loyal citizens to establish a foothold in Britain would be a low-cost, low-risk way of extending Roman influence without committing legions. If the venture failed, he could disavow them. If it succeeded, as it clearly did at this settlement, it created a ready-made infrastructure and a pro-Roman power base for when the time was right for formal annexation. This paints a picture of a much more cunning and nuanced imperial policy, one that operated through proxies and deniable assets long before the banners of the legions were ever unfurled on British soil. This messy, complex reality stands in stark contrast to the clean official story that later Roman historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio would write. Their accounts were composed with the benefit of hindsight, often to flatter the emperors who commissioned them. The chaotic, entrepreneurial free-for-all of the early 1st century didn't fit the image of a destined, orderly imperial expansion. So it was sanitized. The contributions of traders, mercenaries, and political refugees were written out of history, and the narrative was streamlined into the glorious, single moment of Claudius's invasion. The century of gradual, often unofficial, entanglement was compressed and forgotten, replaced by a myth of sudden and total conquest. The discovery of this settlement forces those lost pioneers back into the spotlight, revealing that the roots of Roman Britain were not planted by legionary spades in 43 AD, but by the ambitious, resourceful, and often anonymous individuals who dared to cross the Channel a lifetime earlier, building a new world long before the empire decided to take the credit. This new discovery doesn't just rewrite the Roman side of the story. It completely transforms our understanding of the British tribes themselves. For too long, the narrative has been one of simple opposition brave, freedom-loving Britons like Boudicca resisting a foreign invader. The reality, as the Northamptonshire site reveals, was infinitely more complex and politically savvy. Imagine being a powerful chieftain of a tribe like the Catuvellauni, or the Atrebates around the year 15 BC. Your world isn't an isolated backwater. It's a node in a network of trade and power that stretches all the way to the Mediterranean. The arrival of these Romans wasn't a sudden, terrifying event. It was an opportunity, a new piece on the political chessboard of tribal Britain, and the local leaders were master players. The artifacts from the settlement are a testament to this intricate dance of power and prestige. We find high-status Roman goods, but not in a way that suggests they were simply stolen as plunder. Instead, we see them deliberately placed in the burial mounds of the local elite. A fine Roman glass vessel buried with a British chieftain, or a set of Samian-ware bowls placed as grave goods, speaks a powerful language. For the local rulers, aligning with this new Roman community was a brilliant strategy. By controlling access to these exotic, desirable goods, wine, olive oil, fine pottery, a chieftain could reinforce his own status and power. He could reward loyal followers with gifts that were unavailable anywhere else, creating a clientele utterly dependent on his special relationship with the newcomers. This wasn't a surrender of culture. It was a co-opting of foreign prestige to strengthen a native power structure. The Romans provided the goods, and the British chiefs used them to play their own internal political games, becoming richer and more powerful in the process. This leads to the most fascinating evidence from the site. The presence of distinct British-style artifacts and dietary remains within the Roman settlement itself. Analysis of animal bones and plant remains shows that the inhabitants weren't just eating a Mediterranean diet of olives and grapes. They were consuming large quantities of traditional British foods, like barley and native breeds of sheep and cattle. Even more telling, they were using local handmade pottery alongside their imported Roman wares for everyday cooking. This isn't the pattern of a closed, isolated Roman colony. This points to a deeply integrated community, a place where Britons and Romans lived and worked side by side. The most logical explanation is intermarriage and the creation of mixed households. A Roman merchant or veteran soldier marries the daughter of a local chieftain or a prominent family, forging a political alliance that secures his safety and her family's access to Roman trade. The settlement becomes a cultural melting pot, a place where Celtic and Roman traditions begin to blend into something entirely new, long before the legions arrived to enforce a more rigid version of Romanization. This evidence forces us to abandon the simplistic idea of unified tribal resistance. The political landscape of Britain was fractured, with tribes often being each other's worst enemies. A tribe like the Atrebates, who may have had friendly relations with Rome, would have seen this settlement as a powerful ally against their rivals, the expansionist Catuvellauni. For the Atrebantian king, having a group of well-armed, well-connected Romans on his doorstep was a strategic advantage, a deterrent against his enemies. He might have granted them the land for their settlement in exchange for military support, or a share of their trading profits. This creates a picture of Britain not as a unified nation facing an external threat, but as a collection of competing kingdoms, some of which actively invited and collaborated with Roman influence to gain an edge over their local rivals. The Roman conquest, when it finally came decades later, was likely facilitated by these pre-existing alliances, with some tribes welcoming the legions as liberators from their more powerful British enemies. The real story is one of complex diplomacy, shifting loyalties, and a century of gradual cultural fusion that made the eventual conquest possible. The British weren't just passive victims of history. They were active participants, making calculated choices that shaped their own destiny and the very nature of Rome's presence on their island. And that's precisely what makes this new discovery so powerful. It doesn't stand alone. For years, even decades, archaeologists and historians have been quietly collecting a scattering of oddities, little pieces of evidence that never comfortably fit into the neat timeline we all learned in school. These were the academic loose ends, the puzzling artifacts that were often dismissed as contamination, misidentification, or just inexplicable flukes. But with the confirmation of a pre-Claudian settlement at Northamptonshire, these anomalies suddenly snap into focus. They are no longer outliers. They are corroborating witnesses, a chorus of voices from the soil that have been trying to tell us a different story all along. Consider the strange and persistent mystery of early Roman coins. For generations, coin hoards found in Britain have been categorized by their mint dates, with the assumption that coins from the reigns of Augustus or even Mark Antony must have arrived on the island after the invasion of 43 AD. But there were always those frustrating exceptions. Coins minted in the 1st century BC, long before the conquest, kept turning up in contexts that were deeply puzzling. They weren't just found in later Roman towns. They were discovered in the ditches of Iron Age hill forts, buried in the foundations of native roundhouses, and even found as far north as Yorkshire, far from the supposed landing points of the Claudian army. The standard explanation was that these were heirlooms, old coins kept for centuries before being lost, or perhaps brought over by a single late arriving legionary as a lucky charm. It was a convenient theory, but it never fully satisfied. The sheer geographic spread and the context of these finds suggested a much wider, earlier circulation. Now, with proof of a permanent community using and losing such coins decades before the invasion, the mystery evaporates. These early coins aren't anomalies. They are the small change of a pre-conquest economy, physical proof of a monetary system that was already operating in Britain, likely facilitated by settlements, just like the one in Northamptonshire. Then there is the architectural evidence, the ghostly footprints of buildings that defied easy classification. At sites like Silchester and Verulamium, which later became important Roman towns, excavations have occasionally uncovered early, strange structures beneath the familiar Roman grid. These were rectangular buildings, clearly Roman in their plan, but constructed using a hybrid method, combining Roman-style post-entrench techniques with traditional British materials. For a long time, these were interpreted as the very first, slightly clumsy attempts at Roman construction by the new conquerors after 43 AD. But that interpretation always had a weakness. Why would the sophisticated Roman military engineers, capable of building Hadrian's wall, start with such rudimentary, almost experimental structures? The Northamptonshire discovery offers a far more elegant solution. These hybrid buildings aren't the first fumbling steps of a new administration. They are the signature of the pioneer generation, the first Roman settlers and their British partners who were building our life together with the materials and knowledge available to them. They represent a period of cultural fusion and adaptation, a full generation or more before the standardized, state-sponsored architecture of the official province. What we once saw as primitive beginnings now appear as the mature output of a society that was already decades old. Perhaps the most compelling of these reassessed anomalies comes from the world of the elite. In the territory of the Atrebates tribe, in what is now West Sussex, a spectacular burial was uncovered at a site called Fishbourne, long before the famous palace was built there. This was the grave of a man who was very clearly a native British chieftain, buried with all the traditional rights of his people. But nestled among his personal ornaments and weapons were two stunning, high-status Roman objects: a set of bronze vessels and a beautifully crafted chain mail shirt. The conventional dating, forced into the post-invasion framework, placed this burial just after 43 AD, suggesting the chieftain had been a collaborator, swiftly rewarded by his new Roman overlords. But the new evidence forces a radical rethink. The style of these Roman items, particularly the chain mail, is of a type that was common in the late 1st century BC, not the mid-1st century AD. It's far more likely that this chieftain wasn't a collaborator after the conquest, but a powerful ally before it. He was a man who had forged a strong political and military partnership with the early Roman settlers, perhaps receiving these magnificent gifts as tokens of that alliance. His burial isn't a symbol of subjugation. It's a testament to a powerful, pre-invasion partnership, a relationship between equals that was later written out of the official history. Even the great monuments themselves are now being seen in a new light. Take the sprawling earthworks known as the Chiltern Dykes, a series of massive linear ditches and banks that cut across ancient routeways. These were always attributed to the native British tribes, a defensive system against rival kingdoms, but their scale and sophistication have often given archaeologists pause. With the knowledge that a sophisticated Roman community was operating inland, the possibility arises that these weren't purely British projects. Could they have been collaborative efforts, jointly planned and constructed by local chieftains and their Roman allies to control trade routes and demarcate territory? It's a hypothesis that was unthinkable under the old model, but now it seems not just possible but probable. These scattered clues, the coins in the wrong place, the hybrid buildings, the elite grave goods, the massive earthworks, were like individual stars in the night sky. We could see them, but without the central constellation to connect them, their pattern remained a mystery. The Northamptonshire settlement is that central constellation. It provides the crucial context, the missing narrative that finally allows us to connect these disparate points of light into a coherent and breathtaking new picture of Britain's past, revealing a century of hidden history that was waiting right beneath our feet. Now, with this new, more complex origin story coming to light, a pressing question emerges. If this vibrant, pre-Claudian community was so significant, why was it so thoroughly scrubbed from the historical record? Why did the official narrative insist on a clean start in 43 AD, effectively erasing nearly a century of prior contact? The answer lies not in the dust of archaeology, but in the cutthroat world of Roman imperial politics, and it centers on one man, the Emperor Claudius. To understand why this history was buried, we need to step into his shoes and see the Roman world through his eyes. Claudius was an unlikely emperor, a man who had spent most of his life being ridiculed and overlooked by his own family due to a physical disability. He was seen as a stammering, clumsy academic, not a leader. When the Praetorian Guard thrust him onto the throne after the assassination of his nephew Caligula in 41 AD, his position was incredibly precarious. The military was restless, the Senate was skeptical, and rivals were everywhere. For Claudius, survival depended on one thing above all else: a swift, decisive, and gloriously public military victory. He needed to prove to everyone that he was a true successor to Augustus, a conqueror, not a bookworm. This is where Britain enters the picture as the perfect stage for his political theatre. An invasion of Britain was a legacy project. Julius Caesar had tried it, and even Augustus had contemplated it. For a century, the island had loomed in the Roman imagination as a mysterious, untamed land at the edge of the world. Conquering it would be a triumph that echoed through the forums of Rome, a powerful symbol that the empire was still expanding under its new, unlikely leader. But here was the problem for Claudius. The evidence now shows that Britain wasn't this untouched, mythical prize. It was already deeply entangled with Rome. A full-scale military invasion to conquer a land where Roman merchants were already living peacefully, where client kings were already allied with Rome, and where Roman-style buildings already stood, doesn't carry the same propaganda punch. The glorious conquest starts to look less like a heroic expansion and more like a bureaucratic takeover, the formal annexation of a territory that was already halfway in the empire's orbit. The messy, complicated reality of a century of gradual integration didn't fit the simple, powerful story Claudius needed to tell. So the most compelling theory is that Claudius and his propagandists didn't just overlook this earlier history, they actively suppressed it. They reframed the entire narrative to serve a singular political purpose. The invasion of 43 AD was packaged and sold not as a consolidation of existing influence, but as a bold, brand new beginning. The legions weren't there to formalize a long-standing relationship. They were there to bring civilization to a barbarian land for the very first time. This required systematically downplaying, or outright ignoring the generations of traders, settlers, and diplomats who had come before. The contributions of these early pioneers were politically inconvenient. Their story was one of private enterprise and slow cultural blending, not of imperial glory. Claudius needed a clean slate, a foundation myth that began with his own legions marching across the beaches of Kent. By presenting Britain as a virgin conquest, he could claim sole credit for its subjugation, transforming a complex political process into a simple, heroic tale of his personal triumph. We can see this propaganda machine at work in the official records that have come down to us. Look at the triumphal arch the Senate built in Rome to celebrate Claudius's victory. Its inscription explicitly states that he was the first to bring barbarian peoples across the ocean under Rome's sway. The word "first" is crucial here. It's a deliberate claim of primacy that airbrushes the efforts of Caesar, Augustus, and all the anonymous settlers out of existence. The historians who wrote under the patronage of the imperial court, like Cassius Dio, faithfully echoed this official line. Their accounts focus almost exclusively on the military campaign of 43 AD, presenting it as the absolute start of Roman Britain. The century of pre-invasion contact is reduced to a few vague references, treated as insignificant prelude rather than the crucial foundation it truly was. This wasn't an accidental omission. It was a calculated rewriting of history to serve the needs of the present. A classic case of the victor not just writing the history, but carefully editing it to burnish his own legacy. This also explains the strange fate of the Northamptonshire settlement and others like it. As the official Claudian narrative took hold, these early footholds may have been deliberately marginalized or even abandoned. Why maintain an old, unofficial trading post when a new state-sponsored administration was building proper Roman cities like Camulogenum just a few decades later? The physical evidence suggests that many of these pre-Claudian sites went into decline or were simply built over by the new, official Roman infrastructure. Their story was buried twice, first under the soil, and then under the weight of an imperial propaganda campaign that lasted for 2,000 years. The history we inherited was the one Claudius wanted us to believe, a streamlined, sanitized version that gave all the credit to the state and its emperor, while the true, more fascinating story of the pioneers who paved the way was left hidden, waiting for archaeologists to finally unearth the truth and restore a lost century to its proper place in history. What the archaeologists began to map out was not a haphazard collection of huts, but the full organized plan of a thriving town, a blueprint that directly contradicts the idea of a simple military outpost or a temporary trading post. At its heart was a large, open, rectangular space, unmistakably functioning as a central forum or marketplace. This wasn't a muddy clearing. It was a carefully leveled area, defined by the foundation trenches of porticos or colonnades on at least two sides, creating a covered walkway where people could gather, socialize, and conduct business out of the rain. This central plaza speaks of a community that valued public life and formalized commerce, a core Roman concept, but one that was being enacted here, in the British countryside, decades before such spaces were officially imposed by Rome. Surrounding this public square, the team uncovered the footprints of numerous buildings, and their variety is what truly tells the story of a hybrid society. There were the classic Roman-style rectangular buildings with deep post holes, suggesting framed structures with tiled roofs, but intermingled with these were the unmistakable, large circular stains of traditional British roundhouses. This is not a neighborhood segregated by culture. This is a town where two distinct architectural traditions stood side by side, likely within the same property boundaries. It paints a picture of a single community where a Roman trader might live in a rectangular house next door to his British business partner, who preferred a roundhouse, or perhaps even a single family using both types of buildings for different purposes. A Roman-style building for receiving guests and business, and a roundhouse for cooking and more familiar daily life. The very skyline of this settlement would have been a fascinating blend of angular Roman roofs and the conical thatch of native Britain. The defensive measures around the town further blur the lines between Roman and native. The settlement was enclosed by a large, V-shaped ditch and an earthen rampart, a classic type of Roman defensive earthwork known as a fossa and agger. However, the scale and the specific placement of this defense show a keen understanding of the local landscape, suggesting input from British allies who knew the best ground to fortify. This wasn't a standard imperial fortress. It was a communal defense, built with Roman engineering knowledge, but likely for the protection of everyone inside, regardless of their origin. It was a statement of collective security for a community that knew its presence might attract envy or attack from rival tribes, a physical manifestation of a shared stake in this new enterprise. Moving from defense to industry, the evidence for workshops reveals a settlement that was not just consuming imported goods, but actively producing and processing materials for trade. In one area, archaeologists found thick layers of industrial waste, slag and hammerskel from metalworking. This indicates a blacksmith's forge, likely producing and repairing iron tools and weapons. In another zone, they uncovered kilns for firing pottery. Crucially, the pottery being produced here wasn't purely Roman in style. The fragments show effusion vessels made with local clay, but shaped on a fast-rotating potter's wheel, a Roman technology, and sometimes decorated with both Roman motifs and traditional British patterns. This is the birth of a new, hybrid material culture, created to meet the demands of a mixed population. The people here weren't just passive consumers of culture. They were active creators of a new one. Perhaps one of the most telling signs of long-term planning and sophisticated infrastructure was the discovery of a sophisticated drainage system. The excavators traced a network of carefully dug ditches lining the main streets of the settlement. These weren't just random gullies. They were graded to channel rainwater and waste away from the buildings and into a larger main drain. Some sections were even lined with timber or stone to prevent erosion. This level of investment in public hygiene and water management is not something you do for a seasonal camp. This is the work of people who are building for the future, for their children and grandchildren. It reflects a Roman concern for order and public health, but applied to a community that was officially not even supposed to exist. When you step back and look at this entire layout, the central forum, the mixed housing, the collaborative defenses, the fused industry, and the planned drainage, the conclusion is inescapable. This was not a temporary Roman camp imposing its will, nor was it a native British village that just happened to acquire a few Roman trinkets. This was a planned, permanent, and integrated community. It was a place where Roman and Britain lived together, worked together, and built a shared life, creating a unique social and cultural blend, a full generation before the Roman army officially arrived to claim the credit. This physical blueprint, etched into the earth, is the most powerful evidence yet that the history of Roman Britain is not a simple story of conqueror and conquered, but a far richer, more collaborative, and ultimately more human story of two cultures slowly and voluntarily becoming one. These everyday objects, pulled from the soil of Northamptonshire, are the star witnesses in this historical trial, and their testimony is damning for the old timeline. Let's begin with the coins, the most incontrovertible timekeepers in archaeology. We're not talking about one or two stray finds. The site has yielded hundreds of silver and bronze coins, and their mint dates form a startling pattern. A huge proportion of them was struck during the reign of Emperor Augustus, who died in the year 14 AD, and several are even older, dating back to the era of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the late 1st century BC. Finding coins from the Augustan period in Britain isn't unheard of, but the sheer volume here is the real story. This isn't a collection of heirlooms or a single lost purse. This is the loose change of a bustling economy. These coins were being used, lost, and handed back and forth in daily transactions for goods and services, creating a monetary layer in the soil that consistently dates 30 to 60 years before the Claudian invasion. A bronze as of Augustus, dropped in the mud by a merchant in 15 AD, and found nestled against the foundation post of a building, is a powerful, silent argument that this place was a going concern when the official history says it shouldn't have been. Then we have the amphorae, the ceramic workhorses of the Roman world. Scattered across the excavation were thousands of fragments of these large, distinctive storage jars, easily identifiable by their shape and fabric. Analysis of the clay has traced them directly to the Italian peninsula, specifically to regions famous for producing wine and olive oil. These aren't delicate, decorative pieces. They are the bulky, practical containers used for shipping bulk commodities across the Mediterranean. Finding them here in the heart of Britain is like finding a modern shipping container from Italy in the middle of the English countryside. Each one represents a complex and regular supply chain, a journey from an Italian vineyard to a port, onto a ship that braved the Atlantic coast and the English Channel, then up rivers and finally overland to this inland settlement. The residents of this community weren't just occasionally enjoying a taste of the Mediterranean. They were living a lifestyle dependent on regular imports of wine for drinking and olive oil for cooking, lighting, and personal hygiene. This level of consumption proves a stable, established community with the wealth, and the connections to maintain a trans-continental supply line decades before the Roman state would have organized such logistics for its new province. Perhaps the most thrilling category of evidence comes from the world of the military. Among the finds were pieces of military hardware that are chronologically out of place. One of the most telling objects is a bronze helmet cheekpiece, discovered in the fill of one of the earliest ditches. This isn't the type of helmet worn by the legionaries of Claudius's invasion force. Its design, with specific decorative elements and its method of attachment, is a style known as the culus type, which was common in the late Roman Republic and the very early Empire, falling out of widespread use by the time of the invasion. It's the kind of helmet a soldier from the time of Julius Caesar or Augustus would have worn. Then there are the pilum heads, the deadly iron shanks of the Roman javelin. Several were found, and their specific shape, the long, slender shank and the small, pyramidal head, is a design characteristic of the late Republican era, not the heavier, more robust versions used by the imperial legions of the mid-1st century AD. This isn't just lost equipment. It's a snapshot of an earlier generation of Roman military presence. This gear likely belonged to veterans of Caesar's Gallic wars, or to soldiers who served under Augustus, men who brought their outdated but still functional kit with them to this new frontier, where it was eventually discarded or lost, preserving a moment in military history that predates the official story by 2 generations. But the story isn't told only by the grand imports and the weapons of war. The humble, everyday pottery used for cooking and storage provides an equally compelling, and perhaps more intimate, testimony. Alongside the fine imported Samian ware, archaeologists found a huge quantity of a distinctive type of pottery known as Gallo-Belgic ware. This is a coarse, utilitarian pottery mass produced in northern Gaul, and its chronology is very well established. Stylistic analysis of the forms, the shapes of the bowls, cups, and plates places its peak production and export firmly in the late 1st century BC and early 1st century AD. By the time of the Claudian invasion, the popularity of this particular ware had sharply declined, replaced by other styles. Finding such a massive concentration of Gallo-Belgic pottery at this site is like finding a layer of cassette tapes and VHS tapes in a modern home. It firmly dates the primary period of occupation to that specific technological and cultural window. The very dishes from which these people ate their meals scream out the date, corroborating the story told by the coins and the military equipment. Together, these silent witnesses, the Augustan coins, the Italian amphorae, the outdated helmet, and the time-stamped Gallo-Belgic bowls, form an unbreakable chain of evidence, each object a link that binds this settlement to a specific, and startlingly early, moment in history. This shift in our timeline forces a complete re-evaluation of what motivated the Romans to cross the Channel in the first place. We've been conditioned to think of empires expanding through sheer military might, of conquest as the primary engine of history. But the evidence from this settlement paints a very different, and arguably more modern, picture. It suggests that the true vanguard of Rome wasn't the legionary with his javelin, but the merchant with his ledger. Long before the Roman eagle standard was planted on British soil, the Roman economy had already put down deep and lucrative roots. This was an empire built as much on commerce as on conquest, where trade routes effectively paved the way for marching legions. The sheer volume and variety of goods found at the site act as a detailed manifest, a bill of lading from a forgotten economic revolution. Let's start with what was flowing out of Britain. Historical sources from the continent mention British exports, but we now have physical proof of this trade happening on an industrial scale. Analysis of soil samples from the settlement's workshop areas revealed microscopic traces of metals like tin and lead, key British resources that the Roman world craved. Tin was essential for making bronze, and British lead was used for everything from plumbing pipes to sarcophagi. But it wasn't just raw materials. The Romans had a voracious appetite for prestige goods, and Britain supplied 2 particularly chilling examples. The first was hunting dogs. British greyhounds and mastiffs were renowned across the empire for their size and ferocity, prized for use in the gladiatorial arena and for hunting game. The second, far more disturbing export was human beings. The slave trade was a cornerstone of the Roman economy, and Britain, with its warring tribes, was a fertile ground for capturing and exporting people. This settlement, positioned inland, would have been a key collection point for these tragic human commodities, where captives from inter-tribal conflicts were gathered before being marched to the coast and shipped to a life of servitude in the villas and mines of the continent. In return for these British exports, The settlement was flooded with the creature comforts of the Mediterranean world. We've mentioned the amphorae, but their contents tell the real story. Residue analysis inside these jars has confirmed they held wine from Italy and olive oil from southern Spain. These weren't just luxury items for a tiny elite. They were consumed in such quantities that they imply a broad-based adoption of Roman tastes. Alongside these staples came the finer things. The glossy red Samion tableware that transformed dining from a necessity into a social performance, delicate glass vessels for perfumes and oils, and even items like bronze writing style and in quells, hinting at the introduction of literacy and administrative record-keeping. This wasn't a simple barter system of trinkets for resources. This was a sophisticated, two-way flow of high-value goods that fundamentally altered the local economy and culture. The British elite weren't just acquiring things. They were buying into a lifestyle, a whole package of Roman identity that came with the wine jug and the fine plate. This economic integration created a powerful dependency that made political conquest almost inevitable. Imagine you are a British chieftain whose power now rests on your ability to distribute Roman wine to your followers. Your warriors expect it as a reward, and your status is displayed through the fine pottery on your table. Your entire political structure becomes reliant on the steady flow of these goods. Suddenly, the Roman traders are not just business partners. They are the gatekeepers of your own authority. If they were to leave, your power could collapse. This gave the Romans immense leverage without ever drawing a sword. They created a system where the local ruling class had a vested interest in maintaining stable and friendly relations with Rome. By the time Claudius's legions arrived, many of the most powerful tribes in southern Britain were already economically tethered to Rome. For them, an invasion might not have seemed like a foreign takeover, but rather a shift to a more direct and guaranteed form of supply. A change in management that promised to secure the very trade goods upon which their power depended. The flag followed the trade, and the conquest was, in many ways, the logical conclusion of an economic conquest that had already been won. Now let's turn to the military footprint of this settlement, because this is where the story gets even more fascinating and unconventional. We've uncovered evidence of serious defenses, a substantial V-shaped ditch, and a raised earthen rampart, classic Roman military engineering. But when we look closer at the force that manned these defenses, the picture becomes far less clear and far more interesting than the image of a standard imperial legion. The defensive works suggest a need for protection, but the artifacts and building layouts inside don't point to the neat, orderly footprint of a legionary fortress. There's no symmetrical grid of barracks, no clear-cut principia at the center, none of the rigid, cookie-cutter layout that the Roman army was famous for across the empire. So who was defending this place? And what does their identity tell us about the nature of this early Roman presence? The evidence points toward a hybrid force, a melting pot of military traditions that blurs the lines of identity from the very beginning. One of the most compelling possibilities is that the core of this garrison was composed of auxiliary troops from Roman Gaul. These weren't Roman citizens in gleaming lorica segmentata armor. They were men recruited from the tribes of what is now France and Belgium, fighting for Rome in exchange for pay and the promise of Roman citizenship after their service. This would perfectly explain the mixture of Roman military gear and non-Roman personal items found at the site. We find the pilum heads and the cullis-type helmet, which are Roman issue, but we also find fragments of Gallic-style jewelry, distinctively shaped pottery from northern Gaul, and even remnants of a diet that included foods more common on the continent than in Britain. These men were already cultural hybrids themselves, Gallic warriors who had adopted Roman military discipline and equipment. Stationing them in Britain would have been a brilliant strategic move. They were close enough to their homeland for supply and recruitment, yet effective as a projection of Roman power. Their very presence created a bridge between the Roman world and the British tribes, a bridge built by men who were not entirely Roman themselves. But there's another, even more intriguing possibility, that the security of this settlement was provided by a private army, essentially mercenaries in the employ of the wealthy merchants who ran the trade operations. Imagine a powerful Roman business consortium operating in Gaul, its fortunes tied to the steady flow of British tin and slaves. Protecting that investment would be paramount. It would make perfect sense for them to hire their own security force, perhaps composed of retired Roman legionaries, disgraced soldiers, and adventurous Gallic warriors. This would not be an official Roman army unit, but a corporate security detail, armed with Roman equipment purchased on the open market or brought from their previous service. This explains the non-standard fortifications and the lack of a traditional legionary layout. This wasn't a state-built fort. It was a privately fortified trading post, its defenses designed to protect assets and ensure profits, not to serve an imperial strategic plan. The line between a merchant and a warlord on this early frontier would have been incredibly thin. Perhaps the most revolutionary idea is that a significant portion of this Roman force was actually made up of local Britons themselves. We have to remember that the tribes of southern Britain were not primitive. They were organized, hierarchical societies with their own warrior elites. The discovery of British-style weaponry within the settlement's defensive circuit, such as distinctive native spearheads and the remains of traditional shields alongside Roman gear, strongly suggests that British warriors were integrated into the defense force. Think about the strategic genius of this. A local chieftain, allied with the Roman settlers, might have contributed a contingent of his own men to guard the settlement. In return, his warriors would be paid, equipped with superior Roman arms, and trained in Roman combat techniques. This creates a powerful feedback loop. The British warrior becomes more effective. His chieftain becomes more powerful through this alliance, and the Roman settlement gains a defense force that has intimate knowledge of the local terrain and politics. These men would have been the ultimate hybrids, British warriors fighting in a Roman-style system for a mixed community, under a command structure that likely blended Roman and native concepts of authority. This blurred military identity shatters the traditional narrative of the Roman army as an unstoppable, homogeneous force of conquest. What we see at this settlement is not the top-down imposition of a foreign military system, but the bottom-up creation of a new, pragmatic security solution. The community needed protection from rival tribes, bandits, or even rival Roman factions. They assembled that protection from whatever resources were available. Gallic auxiliaries looking for pay, retired Roman soldiers seeking a new life, and ambitious British warriors looking for advancement. This force wouldn't have marched under a single, pure Roman banner. Its loyalties would have been complex, divided between Roman commanders, Gallic chieftains turned officers, and the merchant patrons who signed their paychecks. The very concept of a Roman army on British soil before the invasion must be redefined. It was likely less an official military unit and more of a multi-ethnic protection racket, a collaborative security force that reflected the hybrid, entrepreneurial nature of the entire settlement. This re-examination forces us to see the Roman military not just as an instrument of the state, but as a fluid concept that could be adopted, adapted, and deployed by a wide range of actors long before the emperor decided to send his legions. The artifacts emerging from this settlement's earliest soil layers tell a story not of collision, but of careful combination, revealing a cultural dialogue that began the moment Romans and Britons encountered one another. This wasn't a case of the superior Roman way, simply replacing local traditions. It was a practical, creative process of borrowing and blending, where both sides saw value in the other's methods. The most telling evidence comes from the pottery. In the workshop area, archaeologists found kilns that were producing a unique kind of ceramic, vessels shaped with the fast-rotating potter's wheel. A Roman technology that allowed for thinner, more uniform walls and greater production speed. But the potters weren't just making standard Roman bowls. They were using local British clays and often finishing their wares with decorative patterns that echoed traditional Celtic art, distinctive curvilinear designs and stamped motifs that would have been deeply familiar to any native Briton. These hybrid pots represent more than just a new style. They represent a new market. The potters, who were likely a mix of Roman-trained craftsmen and local apprentices, were creating a product that appealed to a mixed community, a physical symbol of a society that was consciously building a shared identity from its very foundation. This fusion extended far beyond pottery into the very bones of the settlement's architecture. We find the post holes of unmistakably Roman rectangular buildings, but the construction method itself often incorporated classic British techniques. For instance, some of these structures used wattle and daub for their walls, a method where a woven lattice of wooden strips is covered with a sticky mixture of clay, straw, and dung. This was the quintessential building material of Iron Age Britain, not the brick and stone more commonly associated with Roman construction. The choice was pragmatic. These early settlers used the materials that were most readily available and best suited to the damp British climate. The result was a building that looked Roman in its floor plan from the outside, but felt and smelled British on the inside. Similarly, excavators found the remains of traditional British roundhouses, but some of these featured foundation, trenches rather than simple post holes, a Roman technique that created a more stable and long-lasting structure. This architectural reciprocity shows that the flow of knowledge wasn't a one-way street. The Britons were not passive recipients. They were active participants, adopting and adapting Roman engineering principles to improve their own traditional homes, while the Romans, in turn, were learning from British environmental knowledge. Perhaps the most intimate evidence of this blending comes from the refuse of daily life, the food waste. Detailed analysis of animal bones and plant remains from the earliest phases of the settlement reveals a combined diet. There are bones from animals associated with a Roman diet, like chickens and domestic rabbits, species that were previously unknown in Britain. But these are found mixed with the bones of native breeds of cattle, sheep, and pigs, butchered using both Roman and British techniques. The charred seeds tell the same story. Evidence of cultivated oats and barley, staple British grains, right alongside the remains of imported lentils and figs. This isn't a community that suddenly abandoned its culinary heritage. It's a community that was expanding its palate, creating a new, shared cuisine. The family meal in one of these households might have featured a stew made with local meat and barley, but seasoned with imported herbs and served in a bowl that was a fusion of Roman form and British decoration. This daily, domestic reality is the true birthplace of a new culture, forged not in Senate halls or on battlefields, but around the hearth and the cooking pot. What this means for our understanding of Romano-British history is profound. We have long believed that the distinct Romano-British culture, a blend of Roman and Celtic elements visible in art, religion, and daily life, was a later development. The traditional narrative held that it took centuries of Roman occupation for the native population to slowly adopt Roman ways, resulting in a blended identity only after a long period of subjugation. The Northamptonshire discovery shatters that timeline. It proves that this hybrid culture wasn't a slow, eventual outcome of conquest. It was the foundational condition of contact itself. From the very first handshake, the first trade agreement, the first intermarriage, a new negotiated identity was being constructed. This was not a process of imposition from the top down, but of exchange and experimentation from the ground up. The Romano-British identity wasn't something that happened to people after they were conquered. It was the very medium through which Romans and Britons learned to live together. A collaborative project that began a full century before Britain even became an official Roman province. This forces us to see the entire period not as a story of Romanization, but of becoming Romano-British, a creative and continuous process that defined the region for generations. This glaring silence from the classical sources presents us with a classic historian's dilemma, a conflict between the story told by words and the story told by the dirt. We have an entire settlement, teeming with life and evidence, yet when we turn to the great Roman historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, who are supposed to be our primary guides for this era, we are met with a resounding, almost deafening silence about anything like this. It's not that they don't mention Britain at all before Claudius. They do, but only in the briefest, most dismissive terms, as a land of mystery on the edge of the world. The century of activity we now have proof of is simply missing from their pages. To understand why, we have to step into the shoes of these ancient writers and recognize that they were not objective journalists. They were artists and courtiers with a very specific agenda, and their concept of what was historically important was radically different from our own. The fundamental issue is one of bias, not in the malicious sense, but in the structural one. Roman historiography was not written to provide a comprehensive, social history of everyday people or economic trends. It was primarily a moral and political endeavor, focused almost exclusively on the deeds of great men, emperors, consuls, and generals. Its purpose was to celebrate Roman virtue, illustrate the consequences of vice, and above all, to flatter the current imperial regime by crafting a past that justified its present. For a writer like Tacitus, the real drama of history happened in the Senate House, on the battlefield, and in the palace intrigues of Rome. The slow, grubby work of merchants haggling over lead ingots, the intermarriage between a Gallic auxiliary and a British woman, the construction of a hybrid pottery kiln, these were not the stuff of epic history. They were the background noise of empire, the unglamorous foundation that the great men built upon, and therefore, in the eyes of the elite literary class, utterly unworthy of detailed recording. This creates a massive blind spot in our written record, one that becomes painfully obvious when faced with a discovery like our Northamptonshire settlement. Think of it like this. If we only had the official state records and biographies of presidents and generals, we would know a great deal about specific political decisions and battles, but we might completely miss the entire California gold rush, a chaotic, bottom-up movement of tens of thousands of ordinary people that radically reshaped a continent. The Roman historians were writing about the presidency, while the archaeology is now revealing the gold rush. They documented the official declaration of war by Claudius, while the soil has preserved the ledgers of the traders who made that war almost a formality. Their narrative required a clear, heroic beginning, the legions landing in 43 AD. So they simply compressed or erased the messy, century-long prologue that didn't fit the clean arc of the story they wanted to tell. Cassius Dio, writing more than a century after the events, perfectly exemplifies this top-down bias. His account of the Claudian invasion is a grand drama, focusing on the emperor's personal involvement, the bravery of the legions, and the submission of barbarian kings. It is a story designed to magnify the glory of Rome and its emperor. To include a detailed history of pre-existing Roman communities would have undermined the entire premise of his narrative. It would have transformed Claudius's glorious conquest into a mere administrative consolidation, turning a heroic epic into a boring bureaucratic report. For Dio and his audience, the idea that Roman civilization was already deeply rooted in Britain through the efforts of lowly merchants and half-breed settlers was not just inconvenient. It was ideologically unacceptable. It challenged the core Roman self-image of bringing light to the darkness, of Pax Romana being a gift bestowed by the state, not something that grew organically through unofficial contact. Tacitus, often seen as more critical of the emperors, is no less guilty of this oversight, though for slightly different reasons. His father-in-law, Agricola, was governor of Britain, and his writing is often concerned with the nature of empire and the corruption of power. Yet, even for Tacitus, history is the story of the governing class. His famous line about his work being written, without anger and partiality, is a noble goal, but his focus remains resolutely on the actions of the Roman state and its representatives. The complex, collaborative world of the pre-invasion period, a world that didn't involve a governor or a legionary command, simply fell outside his field of vision. He might mention British tribes in the context of their relations with Rome, but the internal social and economic revolutions caused by decades of trade and cultural exchange were invisible to him. His history is a view from the governor's palace, not from the merchant's warehouse or the mixed household's hearth. This is why archaeology is not just a supplement to the historical record. It is often its essential corrector. The written word gives us the official soundtrack of the past, the soaring anthems composed by the state. But archaeology recovers the ambient noise of daily life, the conversations, the workshops, the meals, the forgotten struggles. It gives a voice to the voiceless, to the 99% of the population who never made it into the annals of Tacitus or Dio. The settlement in Northamptonshire is a powerful testament to this. Its story was not considered important enough to be written down by the elite, but it was important enough to be lived, to be built, and to be left behind in the earth for us to find. The silence of the classical historians is not a proof that this early period didn't happen. It is, in fact, a loud and clear testimony to their own biases, revealing what they valued and, just as crucially, what they ignored. The dirt, in this case, speaks a truer, more complete story than the parchment, forcing us to listen to the past on its own terms, not just on the terms of its most famous scribes. Of course, any discovery that so fundamentally rewrites a chapter of history is bound to ignite a firestorm of debate, and this one has certainly sent shockwaves through the academic world. After the initial excitement, the skeptics have stepped forward, armed with legitimate questions and alternative interpretations, because that is how the engine of historical science works through rigorous, sometimes fierce, scrutiny. One of the most common counter-arguments centers on the nature of the settlement itself. Some historians propose that this wasn't a permanent, integrated community at all, but perhaps a seasonal trading fair, a temporary market where Roman merchants and native Britons would meet for a few weeks each year to barter. In this view, the rectangular buildings could be interpreted as sturdy market stalls or storage sheds, and the mixed artifacts simply the accumulated debris from decades of these brief, annual gatherings. This interpretation would allow the traditional timeline to remain largely intact, framing the site as a point of contact, but not the deeply rooted colony the archaeologists claim. Another line of skepticism questions the dating evidence, particularly the coins. Critics point out that Roman coins, especially those from the reign of Augustus, circulated for a very long time. A coin minted in 15 BC could easily have been in someone's purse for 50 or 60 years before being lost, they argue. Perhaps the settlement was founded around 43 AD, but its earliest inhabitants were using old, inherited currency brought over from Gaul. The presence of an Augustan coin, therefore, doesn't prove Augustan occupation. It only proves that someone at some later date possessed an old coin. They also raise questions about the integrity of the archaeological layers, suggesting that later Roman or even medieval farming activity could have churned up the soil, mixing early Roman artifacts with earlier Iron Age material, creating a false impression of coexistence that never actually happened in a single moment. The discovery team, however, has robust, multi-layered responses to each of these challenges. They agree that a single coin could be an heirloom, but they counter that the statistical pattern is undeniable. Finding hundreds of early coins, concentrated in the earliest layers of the site, and crucially, finding them alongside early Gallo-Belgic pottery that also dates to that specific period, creates a powerful converging line of evidence. It's the combination that is key. It's not just one clock ticking, but several independent clocks all synchronized to the same early time. To the idea of a seasonal fair, they point to the sheer investment in infrastructure. You do not dig a massive, engineered V-shaped defensive ditch, or build a sophisticated drainage system for a seasonal market. One lead archaeologist has stated, "You don't construct a Roman-style granary with raised floors to store grain for a few weeks of the year." The level of permanence and planning we see here speaks to a community that was digging in for the long haul, investing in its future over generations. Regarding the mixing of layers, the team points to the pristine, undisturbed contexts from which their key evidence came. The foundation post of a building was sealed directly by the original construction layer. The early coins were found at the very bottom of the defensive ditch, resting on the pristine, untouched natural clay that the first settlers had dug into. This is the archaeological equivalent of a sealed time capsule. The material in that ditch fill had to have been deposited during or immediately after the ditch was dug. It couldn't have filtered down from later periods. This meticulous contextual analysis is what allows them to state with such confidence that the early coins and the early pottery were in use at the exact same time the settlement was founded. This vigorous debate is not a sign of weakness in the discovery. On the contrary, it is the hallmark of a truly transformative find. It forces everyone to sharpen their arguments, to re-examine their assumptions, and to look for even more evidence. The healthy, sometimes heated, exchange between the skeptics and the proponents is what drives historical understanding forward. It prevents a single interpretation from becoming dogma too quickly, and ensures that the new narrative that eventually emerges is robust, well-tested, and able to withstand the toughest scrutiny. This living, breathing academic conversation makes the story of Roman Britain feel more alive and relevant than ever, reminding us that history is not a collection of settled facts in a book, but a dynamic, ongoing investigation into who we are and where we came from. Indeed, the story emerging from Northamptonshire becomes even more compelling when we realize it isn't an isolated historical fluke. This pattern of quiet, unofficial expansion preceding the grand, official conquest appears to have been a recurring play in the Roman imperial handbook. If we look beyond the English Channel to other frontiers, we find a similar shadow history lurking just beneath the surface of the official record, suggesting that what we are uncovering in Britain was part of a much broader, sophisticated strategy of imperial growth. The Roman Empire, it seems, often sent its merchants and diplomats long before it ever committed its legions, using economic and cultural entanglement as a weapon to soften up target regions for eventual takeover. Consider the vast, forested lands of Germania, east of the Rhine. The traditional history, drawn largely from Roman accounts like those of Tacitus, paints a picture of a clear, hard border. It's a story defined by a single, catastrophic Roman defeat, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, where 3 entire legions were annihilated by a coalition of Germanic tribes led by Arminius. This disaster, we were told, shocked Rome to its core, forcing Emperor Augustus to abandon any dream of conquering Germania and establishing the Rhine River as the permanent, fortified limit of the empire. It's a clean, dramatic narrative of a frontier sealed by military failure. However, recent archaeology is chipping away at this stark division, revealing a far more porous and interconnected world. Excavations at sites like Wallgerms, deep in modern-day Germany, have uncovered the remains of a substantial Roman civilian settlement, complete with a forum and Roman-style buildings, that was founded around 4 BC and flourished for over a decade. This was not a military fortress. It was a trading and administrative center, a clear attempt to create a foothold of Roman influence and lifestyle well beyond the Rhine. Its destruction coincides neatly with the Varian disaster, showing that Rome's ambition wasn't crushed in a single battle, but was part of a longer-term effort at integration that was brutally cut short. The finds from Wallgerms and other sites suggest that for years, Roman goods, ideas, and people were filtering into Germania, creating client relationships and factions friendly to Rome, much like the scenario we now see in pre-Claudian Britain. The Teutoburg defeat ended the official project, but it didn't erase the evidence of the unofficial one that came before it. We can see a similar, yet ultimately more successful, process unfold in the arid landscapes of North Africa. The famous Roman province of Africa, a breadbasket for the empire centered on the ancient city of Carthage, was officially established after the Third Punic War ended in 146 BC, with Carthage's utter destruction. The official narrative is one of ruthless, total conquest. But if we look closer, the story is more nuanced. Long before the legions landed for the final siege, Roman merchants and Italian traders had already established a powerful and pervasive economic presence in the region. The archaeological record shows that Italian-made amphorae, ceramics, and other goods were flooding into North African ports and filtering inland for decades, perhaps even a century before the war. Roman businessmen had deeply embedded themselves in the local Punic economy, creating dependencies and forging alliances with local Berber chieftains, who were often at odds with the Carthaginian elite. When Rome finally decided to move in for the kill, it wasn't attacking a completely foreign land. It was severing the head of a system whose body it already partly controlled through trade and diplomacy. The conquest of Carthage, much like the later invasion of Britain, looks less like the opening of a new frontier and more like the final, violent act in a long campaign of economic and political subversion. This recurring pattern points to a deliberate and highly effective imperial methodology. Modern scholars often refer to this as a strategy of soft power expansion. Instead of relying solely on the hard power of military force, Rome expertly wielded economic inducements and cultural influence to achieve its goals. By creating a network of trade that made local elites dependent on Roman goods, wine, olive oil, fine pottery, and luxury items, they could exercise significant political leverage without ever drawing a sword. A chieftain whose status depends on his ability to distribute Roman wine to his followers is far less likely to oppose Roman interests. By establishing civilian settlements beyond the official frontier, they created pockets of Roman culture that acted as listening posts, centers for intelligence gathering, and magnets for disaffected locals seeking new opportunities. These settlements normalized the Roman presence, making the eventual arrival of the legions seem, to some, less like an invasion and more like a logical next step, or even a welcome stabilization. This soft power approach was cost-effective, deniable, and created the very conditions that made military conquest easier and cheaper to achieve when the time was right. The official histories, written to celebrate the glory of emperors and the valor of legions, naturally emphasized the dramatic, final act of conquest. The slow, patient, and often messy work of the merchants, settlers, and diplomats who laid the groundwork was simply not as glamorous, and so it was often relegated to the background, waiting for archaeologists to piece it together from the broken pottery and foundation trenches they left behind. The discovery in Britain is therefore not just rewriting British history. It is offering us a crucial key to understanding the true, complex engine of Roman imperial expansion. An engine that ran as much on commerce and cultural attraction as it did on cold, hard steel. This remarkable find, a story hidden for 2 millennia, might have remained lost forever if not for a silent revolution in how we explore the past. It wasn't just shovels and trowels that uncovered this lost chapter. It was a sophisticated arsenal of 21st century technology that acted like a medical scanner for the landscape, allowing us to diagnose the earth and see the ghosts of history beneath the soil. The entire investigation began not with a single dig, but from the sky itself. Before a single trench was opened, the team employed a powerful remote sensing technology called LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. A plane equipped with a laser scanner flew over the serene Northamptonshire fields, firing millions of invisible laser pulses at the ground. By precisely measuring how long each pulse took to bounce back, the system could strip away the modern clutter of vegetation and buildings to create an extraordinarily detailed, three-dimensional map of the bare Earth surface. What appeared to the naked eye as perfectly flat, featureless farmland was revealed by LiDAR to be etched with a subtle, almost imperceptible topography. There were the faint, linear depressions of filled-in ditches, the gentle, rounded bumps of collapsed earthen ramparts, and the clear, geometric patterns of enclosures and trackways. It was like discovering a hidden drawing on a canvas everyone thought was blank. This bird's-eye view gave the archaeologists the blueprint, the overall street plan of the settlement, allowing them to pinpoint exactly where to dig with surgical precision, saving years of random, fruitless searching. With the LiDAR map in hand, the next step was to use ground-penetrating technology to confirm what the sky had seen. This is where geophysical survey techniques came into play, acting like an X-ray for the top few meters of soil. Teams walked systematically across the fields, pushing instruments like magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar units. A magnetometer is a supremely sensitive device that measures tiny variations in the Earth's magnetic field. When ancient humans lit fires, baked pottery in kilns, or even just lived in daub-walled buildings, the intense heat permanently altered the magnetic signature of the surrounding soil and clay, creating anomalies that the magnetometer can detect. As the team walked, their instruments painted a digital picture of what lay beneath. On their screens, the ghostly outlines of the settlement began to materialize. The dark, rectangular signatures of Roman buildings showed up clearly against the undisturbed natural ground. The long, straight lines of roads and property boundaries emerged, and the distinctive shape of the large V-shaped defensive ditch appeared as a stark, dark line. It was a non-invasive miracle, allowing them to see the entire layout of the town without breaking the ground, confirming that the LiDAR results were not just natural features, but the unmistakable footprint of a lost community. But the technological marvels didn't stop at mapping structures. The team then turned to the very chemistry of the soil itself to read the story of human activity. They conducted extensive soil phosphate analysis, a method that detects the long-term residue of human and animal occupation. Where people and animals live, they leave behind organic waste rich in phosphates. These phosphates bind tightly to soil particles and can persist for thousands of years. By taking hundreds of small soil cores from across the site and analyzing their chemical composition, the archaeologists could create a vivid heat map of ancient life. Areas with off-the-charts phosphate levels pinpointed the locations of animal pens, latrines, and middens, the garbage dumps of the settlement. Other areas showed chemical signatures consistent with intensive metalworking or other industrial activities. This chemical fingerprinting allowed them to understand the function of different parts of the town, distinguishing the industrial quarter from the residential areas and the animal corrals, adding a rich, functional layer to the architectural map provided by the geophysics. This high-tech toolkit represents a fundamental shift in the very nature of archaeology. Just a generation or two ago, finding a site like this would have been a matter of sheer luck or decades of painstaking, educated guesswork. Previous archaeologists walked these same fields and saw nothing. Their methods were limited to what they could see on the surface, a scatter of pottery fragments after ploughing, or a noticeable earthwork, and they simply did not possess the senses to perceive the world that lay just a meter beneath their feet. The technology we have today grants us a form of historical clairvoyance. It allows us to ask broader questions of the landscape, to investigate entire regions rather than just single, obvious sites. We are no longer just excavators. We are landscape historians, using these tools to understand how a settlement fit into its environment, how it connected to others, and how the entire territory was organized and used. The discovery in Northamptonshire is a triumph not just of diligent digging, but of this new scientific paradigm. It stands as powerful proof that the past is not a closed book, but a living, dynamic field of study where every technological advance gives us a new lens through which to view it, revealing secrets that our ancestors, for all their skill and dedication, simply could not see. While the academic debate continues to simmer in journals and conferences, the ripples from this discovery are already spreading far beyond the university walls, beginning the slow but certain process of rewriting a story etched into the national consciousness. Imagine a generation of British schoolchildren who grew up, as many of us did, with a clear and simple timeline: the Celts, then the Romans arriving in 43 AD, followed by the Anglo-Saxons. It's a neat, compartmentalized past, a foundational block of national identity. Now that block is being carefully chiseled apart, and the process of integrating this new, messier truth into the public mind is both a challenge and a thrilling opportunity. Museums, those custodians of our shared heritage, are on the front lines of this shift. At major institutions like the British Museum and smaller local museums across the country, curators are quietly but urgently revising their displays. The classic Invasion of Britain exhibit, once dominated by a map with dramatic arrows sweeping across the Channel in 43 AD, is being supplemented. New panels now speak of contact and commerce, showing the earlier trade routes and displaying artifacts like the very Gallo-Belgic pottery and Augustan coins found at Northamptonshire. The narrative is being stretched back in time, transforming the invasion from a sudden beginning into a pivotal moment within a much longer and more intricate relationship. This shift presents a fascinating challenge for educators. We had the opportunity to speak with a secondary school history teacher from Kent, who shared the excitement and complexity of bringing this new story into the classroom. For years, she explained, teaching the Roman invasion was straightforward. It was a clear event, a great story with set pieces like Claudius's elephants and Boudicca's rebellion. Now we have to introduce a century of prehistory, a period of economic and cultural blending that doesn't have the same simple drama. It's harder to teach, but it's so much more honest and interesting. She described a lesson where she now shows students two maps, one of the official Roman province after 43 AD, and a new speculative map showing the potential locations of pre-Claudian trading settlements, like the one in Northamptonshire. The questions it sparks are incredible. Students start to ask, so if the Romans were already here, were they really invaders? Or does this mean Boudica was fighting people who were partly Roman? It forces them to think in shades of grey, to understand history as a process of messy integration, rather than a series of clean conquests. It's teaching them critical thinking, not just memorization. The impact even touches on deeper, more subtle notions of national identity. For a long time, the story of Roman Britain served a specific purpose. It was a tale of civilized Romans encountering brave, if primitive, ancient Britons. A narrative that could be co-opted by later generations to serve various political ends. The idea of a pure British resistance to a foreign occupier is a powerful and enduring myth. This new discovery profoundly complicates that myth. A local historian from Cornwall, a region proud of its Celtic heritage, expressed a nuanced view. There's always been a romantic attachment to the idea of our ancient ancestors holding out against the empire, he said. This find doesn't destroy that, but it enriches it. It shows that some Britons were collaborating, trading, and intermarrying long before the legions came. It makes our past less about as simple us versus them, and more about the choices real people made to trade, to ally, to resist. That's a more human, and in many ways a more British, story of pragmatism and adaptation. This process of public digestion is being accelerated by the powerful medium of television documentaries, which have the ability to visualize this new history for millions. Production companies are already developing new series that will use CGI to reconstruct the Northamptonshire settlement, not as a military fort, but as a bustling, multicultural trading town. Its skyline a mix of Roman rectangular roofs and British thatched roundhouses. These programs will show actors portraying not just Roman legionaries, but Roman merchants haggling with British chieftains over the price of lead, and mixed families sharing meals that combine imported wine with local barley. This visual storytelling is crucial because it makes the abstract concept of cultural fusion tangible and relatable. It moves the story from the dusty pages of academic reports into the living rooms of everyday people, allowing them to see this lost world come to life, and in doing so, to understand that their island's history has always been one of connection and exchange with the wider world, not of isolation. The school books are indeed being rewritten, but more importantly, the very imagination of the past is being reshaped, creating a richer, more complex, and ultimately more truthful foundation for understanding not just where Britain came from, but how all cultures are formed through endless, fascinating negotiation. This new timeline forces us to completely re-evaluate one of the most iconic figures in British history, Queen Boudica. Her fiery rebellion in the years 60 and 61 AD has long been portrayed as the ultimate act of native resistance, a desperate, righteous uprising against a brutal foreign occupation that was still new and alien. The story, as told by the Roman historian Tacitus, is simple and powerful. The Romans, freshly arrived, brutally annexed the kingdom of the Iceni tribe after their king's death, publicly flog his widow Boudica, and assault her daughters. This single monstrous act of injustice sparks a unified Celtic fury, a war of liberation that nearly sweeps the Romans back into the sea. It's a compelling, emotionally charged narrative of good versus evil. But what if that framing is fundamentally incomplete? The existence of a long-established, deeply embedded Roman presence for generations before the rebellion forces us to see Boudica's war not as a sudden explosion against a new occupier, but as the violent, inevitable climax of a century of simmering social and economic pressure. Consider the world Boudica actually inhabited, a world reshaped by the evidence from Northamptonshire. For nearly 100 years by the time she reached adulthood, Roman influence had been a constant, transformative force in southern Britain. It wasn't a recent shock, it was the established order. This means the rebellion's roots likely ran far deeper than a single horrific act of violence against a queen. That act was the spark, but the tinder had been piling up for generations. The real conflict was likely a complex civil war, pitting those who had benefited from the Roman connection against those who had been ruined by it. For a century, a new hybrid elite had been forming tribal chieftains and their families who grew wealthy and powerful through their alliances with Roman traders, who adopted Roman luxuries, and whose authority became dependent on maintaining that lucrative relationship. This created a vast social fissure within British society. On one side stood this pro-Roman aristocracy, on the other the traditionalists, the poorer freemen, the Druids whose spiritual authority was threatened, and all those who had been marginalized or displaced by this new economic reality. The economic motivations for the revolt now appear far more profound than simple plunder. Decades of Roman economic policy, both official and unofficial, had systematically dismantled the old tribal economies. The Roman demand for taxes, paid in coin, forced a shift from a subsistence and barter system to a cash economy, a transition that immiserated many ordinary farmers. The Roman practice of making large, tied loans to allied chieftains, a policy explicitly mentioned by Tacitus as a grievance, wasn't a new tactic of the post-invasion administration. It was the logical extension of the century-old trade relationships we now have proof of. A chieftain like Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, may have been deeply in debt to Roman financiers long before the governor's soldiers arrived to collect. When he died, the Romans called in that debt, not as a sudden act of aggression, but as the enforcement of a long-standing financial arrangement. The flogging of Boudica and the assault on her daughters were not just acts of cruelty. They were a brutal public demonstration intended to shatter the authority of a native ruler who was part of this old, collaborative system, signaling that the era of negotiated power was over, replaced by direct, unanswerable Roman rule. This perspective also dramatically changes our understanding of the rebellion's targets. Boudica's army didn't just attack Roman military installations. They focused their most destructive fury on the three developing urban centers of Roman Britain: Camulogenum, Londinium, and Verulamium. The traditional explanation is that these were symbols of the new Roman oppression. But with our new timeline, their significance deepens. These towns weren't just new foundations. They were the ultimate expression of the century-long collaboration between Rome and the British elite. Camulogenum was built on the land of the Trinovantes tribe, who had been allies of Rome since the time of Caesar. It was filled with a temple to the deified Emperor Claudius, a structure likely funded and supported by the very British aristocrats who had benefited most from the Roman connection. When Boudica's forces destroyed these towns with such ferocity, they weren't just attacking Roman buildings. They were attacking the physical manifestations of a social betrayal. They were tearing down the seats of power of their own rival tribesmen, and the collaborative class who had prospered while others suffered. The archaeological layer of burnt debris in these cities is not just the residue of an anti-Roman revolt. It is the scorched earth of a violent internal reckoning, a class war, and a cultural civil war all rolled into one. Even the role of the Druids, famously centered on the island of Mona, takes on a new dimension. The Roman attack on Mona in the same period is often framed as an assault on a center of native resistance. But in the context of a century of entanglement, It looks more like the final blow in a long-term campaign to break the back of the only organized, island-wide institution that could rival Roman authority. The Druids were not just priests. They were the judges, the scholars, the keepers of the native law and oral history that bound the tribes together. For 100 years, the slow creep of Roman commerce, law and culture had been undermining their authority. The Roman military assault on their sanctuary was the brutal, final act in a long process of cultural erosion. An attempt to decapitate the last independent source of power that could unite the tribes against the new collaborative order that Rome had so carefully cultivated. Boudicca's rebellion, therefore, becomes the last, great convulsion of this older Britain. A coalition of those left behind by a century of change, led by a queen who was not just avenging a personal wrong, but fighting to overthrow an entire system that had been patiently built around her and her people, long before she was ever born. But if the artifacts and architecture tell a story of cultural blending, the most intimate and undeniable evidence comes from the people themselves, written in the very code of their being. We are now entering the revolutionary field of paleogenetics, a discipline that allows us to read ancient DNA extracted from human remains, and the results from the Northamptonshire skeletons are nothing short of a biological bombshell. While pottery can be traded and buildings can be copied, a person's genetic ancestry is a permanent record of their lineage, a direct link to their ancestors and the journeys they took. By analyzing the fragile DNA preserved in the teeth and bones of individuals buried at the settlement, scientists are able to peer across millennia and ask a question we could never before answer with such certainty. Who were these people, and where did they truly come from? The preliminary genetic data paints a picture that perfectly corroborates the archaeological findings, revealing a community that was fundamentally, genetically mixed from its very inception. The science behind this is as fascinating as the results. Extracting ancient DNA is a painstaking process, conducted in sterile laboratories to prevent any contamination from modern DNA. Scientists drill into the dense petrous bone of the skull, a part of the inner ear that often preserves DNA best, or take samples from the roots of well-preserved teeth. They are not looking for intact strands of DNA. After centuries in the ground, the genetic material is shattered into tiny fragments. Using sophisticated sequencing technology, they can read these millions of tiny pieces and, like assembling an immense, microscopic jigsaw puzzle, reconstruct enough of the individual's genome to determine their ancestry. They look for specific genetic markers that are known to be common in certain populations. For instance, there are distinct genetic signatures that are overwhelmingly found in the Iron Age populations of Britain, and other sets of markers that are characteristic of people from the European continent, particularly from regions like Gaul and the Italian peninsula. By comparing the DNA of the skeletons from the settlement to these known genetic maps of the ancient world, researchers can pinpoint their geographical origins with remarkable precision. The results from the Northamptonshire burials are strikingly clear. They show that the community was not a homogeneous group of Romans or a single tribe of Britons. Instead, the genetic data reveals a spectrum of ancestry. Some individuals show genetic profiles that are almost entirely native British, consistent with the local Iron Age population. Others carry a strong signal of continental European ancestry, with genetic markers pointing directly to Gaul or even the Italian peninsula. But the most telling finds are the individuals who show a mixture of both. These people, who lived and died in this 1st century BC community, were the biological children of that early integration. Their very existence is the ultimate proof of intermarriage and the creation of families that blended British and continental lineages a full generation or more before the Claudian invasion. This isn't just evidence of cohabitation. It's evidence of the most intimate form of cultural exchange, where two distinct populations were literally becoming one people, creating a new genetically hybrid generation right at the dawn of Roman contact. This genetic evidence does more than just confirm intermarriage. It provides a powerful new lens through which to view the social structure of the settlement. The burial practices themselves add another layer to this story. Interestingly, individuals with predominantly continental European ancestry were not buried in a way that was radically different from those with native British DNA. They were all interred in the same burial ground, often with a similar mix of grave goods. A person with genetic ties to Gaul might be buried with a Roman-style brooch, but also with a traditional British pottery vessel. This suggests that genetic origin was not the primary determinant of status or identity in this community. What mattered was their shared existence in this new, collaborative venture. They appear to have developed a common, hybrid identity that transcended their diverse origins. The community was likely bound together by shared economic interests, mutual defense, and the new social bonds created by those very intermarriages that the DNA so clearly reveals. Their identity was not a simple question of Roman or Briton, but something new and fluid, forged in the crucible of this frontier settlement. Furthermore, the genetic timeline adds another unassailable layer to the dating of the site. By using techniques like radiocarbon dating on the skeletal remains themselves, scientists can securely place these individuals in a specific window of time. The results consistently point to the late 1st century BC and early 1st century AD. When you have the skeleton of a person with mixed British and Gallic ancestry, and the radiocarbon date from their bone collagen places their death around 10 AD, the argument is settled. You cannot have a biologically mixed population in Britain decades before the official Roman arrival, unless there was a sustained, peaceful, and intimate coexistence already well underway. The DNA acts as a biological clock, ticking in perfect synchrony with the coins, the pottery, and the tree rings, creating a convergence of evidence from the cultural, the material, and now the biological realm. This multi-pronged scientific assault on the old historical timeline leaves it with no place left to hide. The people themselves, silent for 2,000 years, are now speaking through their genes, and their message is clear. The history of Roman Britain began not with the blast of a legionary trumpet, but with the quiet, hopeful cries of their children, born from a union of two worlds. What the story of this Northamptonshire settlement ultimately teaches us is something far bigger than just a correction to the timeline of Roman Britain. It forces a complete re-evaluation of how empires themselves actually function. For too long, we've pictured empires like Rome as monolithic, centralized states that expanded with the clean, deliberate sweep of a general's hand on a map, legions marching, borders solidifying, and an official culture being imposed from the top down. It's a neat, authoritative image, but the reality emerging from the English soil is far messier, more organic, and in many ways more familiar. This discovery reveals empires not as rigid, impermeable entities, but as fuzzy, decentralized networks. Long before the central state makes its official move, it's the unofficial actors, the traders, the adventurers, the migrants, the fortune seekers who are out there on the frontier, creating facts on the ground. They build the relationships, establish the trade routes, and blend the cultures, effectively building a foundation so sturdy that when the state finally arrives, its job isn't to conquer so much as to formalize a situation that already exists. This pattern of unofficial pioneers preceding the official state is not unique to Rome. It's a recurring theme throughout world history, a kind of hidden engine of imperial expansion. Consider the Spanish Empire in the Americas. The official story often begins with figures like Hernán Cortés, the conquistador leading a formal expedition under the Spanish crown. But what we often forget are the decades of unofficial contact that came before. Spanish and Portuguese fishermen had been secretly working the rich cod banks off Newfoundland for years, and shipwrecked sailors or escaped slaves had been living among indigenous populations, learning their languages and customs, long before any governor set foot in the New World. These anonymous individuals were the true vanguard. They created the first, fragile networks of communication and trade, and their knowledge of the land and its people was absolutely essential for the official conquistadors who followed. Cortés himself relied heavily on such a person, a shipwrecked Spanish priest turned slave, who acted as his interpreter and cultural guide. The Spanish crown didn't invent the connection to the Aztec Empire. It stepped into a web of pre-existing informal contacts and exploited them for its own purposes. We can see a similar dynamic at play with the British Empire in India. The official narrative often focuses on the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the subsequent takeover by the British East India Company, a state-chartered entity. But for over a century before that decisive battle, a motley crew of independent British interlopers had been operating outside the official company's monopoly. These were private traders, ex-soldiers, and ambitious adventurers who smuggled goods, formed deep commercial and personal relationships with local Indian rulers and merchants, and often acted as freelance political agents. They learned the languages, navigated the complex court politics, and built the commercial infrastructure that made large-scale trade possible. The British state, through the East India Company, didn't create this network from scratch. It gradually co-opted, regulated, and ultimately took control of a system that had been built by these daring, often unruly, private individuals. The empire was not imposed from London. It grew from the ground up through a century of unofficial entanglement, and the state eventually moved in to manage the chaos and harvest the profits. Even the expansion of the United States westward in the 19th century follows this same decentralized blueprint. The official story is one of government-sponsored expeditions, like Lewis and Clark, followed by treaties, military campaigns, and the organized arrival of settlers. But the true cutting edge of American expansion were the mountain men, trappers and explorers like Jedediah Smith, who moved into the Rocky Mountains and the far west entirely on their own initiative, decades before the U.S. government had any meaningful presence or claim there. They forged the trails, mapped the territories, and established trading relationships with Native American tribes. Their activities created economic incentives and geographical knowledge that made the later official waves of migration and conquest not just possible, but almost inevitable. The U.S. government didn't lead the way west. It followed the paths blazed by these unofficial agents, later sending in the army to protect the settlers who came in their wake and to enforce treaties that formalized American control over lands these pioneers had already effectively entered. So why does this pattern repeat itself across so many different times and cultures? The answer lies in the fundamental nature of states versus individuals. A central state is, by its nature, cautious, bureaucratic, and risk-averse. Committing the prestige and resources of the state to a foreign venture is a huge gamble. But for an individual trader or an adventurer, the potential rewards of getting in early on a new frontier can outweigh the immense risks. These pioneers operate with a flexibility and a speed that no state bureaucracy can ever match. They can adapt to local conditions, form personal alliances, and change tactics instantly. They are the perfect agents for what historians call informal empire, the exercise of influence through economic and cultural means rather than direct political control. The state, watching from a distance, can let these individuals take the risks. If they fail, the state can disavow them. But if they succeed, as they did in Northamptonshire, they create a foothold, a network of dependency, and a body of local knowledge that makes the eventual official intervention cheaper, easier, and far more likely to succeed. This new perspective fundamentally changes how we should view historical maps. Those clean, colored lines showing the growth of the Roman Empire are a fiction, a retrospective simplification. The reality was a fuzzy, shifting frontier zone, a spectrum of influence rather than a hard border. On the ground, it was a world of mixed communities, dual allegiances, and cultural experimentation, all happening long before the cartographers in Rome ever drew a definitive line. The story of the Roman settlement in Britain, therefore, is more than just an archaeological curiosity. It is a powerful case study in the real mechanics of power. It shows us that the grand narratives of conquest, the stories of emperors and legions that have come down to us through the ages, are just the final public act of a much longer and more complex drama. The true work of building an empire was often done not in the Senate or on the battlefield, but in the marketplace, in the mixed household, and in the quiet, determined efforts of ordinary people seeking a better life, whose actions collectively paved the way for history's most famous empires to follow. So with this incredible new timeline now laid out before us, with the story of our Roman pioneers restored to its rightful place, you might think the case is closed. But in many ways, the real work is just beginning. Every groundbreaking discovery in archaeology doesn't just provide answers. It rips open a whole new set of questions, and this one is no exception. The settlement at Northamptonshire has given us a new origin story, but it has also left us with some tantalizing and frankly thrilling mysteries that are now driving the next wave of historical research. The picture is clearer, yet somehow more mysterious than ever. First and foremost, the question that is haunting every archaeologist in Britain right now is a simple one. Was this place unique? Were these settlers a lone group of extraordinary pioneers, a single, daring experiment that happened to succeed? Or is the Northamptonshire settlement just the first domino to fall? The implications of this are enormous. If this was a one-off venture, it's a fascinating historical footnote. But if it was part of a broader, coordinated pattern, then we are looking at a completely unrecognized chapter of British history. A secret network of Roman settlements dotting the landscape. The hunt is now on, and it's transforming how archaeologists are looking at the British countryside. Teams are re-examining old excavation reports from the 19th and 20th centuries, looking for anomalies that were previously dismissed. They are scouring LiDAR data and geophysical surveys of known Iron Age sites, searching for the subtle rectangular footprint of a Roman building hiding amongst the traditional roundhouses. Every strange, out-of-place artifact, every early coin found in a puzzling context, is now being seen in a new light as a potential clue pointing to another lost community. The race is on to find a second site, because it's the pattern that will prove this was a systematic colonization, not just a lucky accident. Then there is the mystery of leadership. We can infer a lot about the people from their pottery and their post holes, but one question burns brightly. Who was the visionary, the charismatic figure who brought them all together? A venture this complex, this risky, doesn't happen by committee. It requires a leader, a person of immense ambition, resources, and persuasion. Was it a rogue Roman senator, a disgraced aristocrat looking to build his own power base far from the emperor's gaze? Was it a brilliant, opportunistic merchant prince from Gaul, a man who saw a fortune to be made by controlling the flow of British tin and slaves? Or was it a powerful British king, a chieftain who saw an alliance with these technologically advanced strangers as the key to dominating his rivals. The archaeological evidence gives us hints of a hierarchical society, the potential headquarters building, the disparity in grave goods, but the identity of the founder remains a ghost. His name is lost, his motives are obscured, but his legacy is written across the entire settlement. Finding any form of an inscription, a single name carved into a stone or stamped on a lead seal, would be the holy grail that could finally put a face to this revolution. And this leads to the final and perhaps most poignant, unresolved question. What happened to them in the end? The settlement, for all its success, was eventually abandoned or absorbed. The evidence shows a decline, a gradual fading rather than a violent end. So what was the specific event or process that caused this vibrant, hybrid community to vanish from the historical stage? One theory is that it was simply rendered obsolete. When the Claudian invasion happened in 43 AD, it brought with it the full, overwhelming force of the Roman state. New official towns were founded with straight streets and stone forums. New regulated trade routes were established. The old unofficial trading post, with its wattle and door buildings and its complex web of personal alliances, may have simply been bypassed by history. Its residents might have packed up and moved to the new, shiny Roman city of Verulamium, integrating seamlessly into the official province, and leaving their old home to slowly rot back into the earth. Another, more dramatic possibility is that the settlement was a casualty of the very political shifts it helped to create. As Rome's influence grew, so did the tensions between British tribes. This community, built on an alliance with one specific tribe, could have become a target for their rivals. Perhaps it was sacked and burned by a hostile war band from a tribe that rejected the Roman connection. Alternatively, its fate might be tied to the Great Rebellion of Boudica. If this settlement was seen as a symbol of the collaborative elite that had prospered while others suffered, it could have been one of the first places attacked by the rebel forces. Its charred remains lost beneath the more famous destruction layers of Camulogenum and Londinium. The truth is, we don't yet know the final chapter of their story, but that uncertainty is what makes history so alive. It means that the next turn of an archaeologist's trowel, the next scan of a field, the next fragment of a tablet decoded, could provide the answer. This discovery hasn't closed the book on Roman Britain. It has ripped out the final chapter and challenged us, the detectives of the present, to write it ourselves. So here we are, standing at the end of a journey that began in a quiet English field, and has led us to the very edges of our historical understanding. A single archaeological site, a collection of post holes, pottery and ancient DNA, has done more than just add a new fact to the history books. It has fundamentally broken the old narrative and handed us the pieces, challenging us to assemble a new, far more compelling picture of the past. We came into this story thinking we knew the plot, a clean, decisive Roman invasion in 43 AD, a period of occupation, and then a withdrawal. It was a straightforward tale of conqueror and conquered, a story set in stone, quite literally, by monuments like Hadrian's Wall. But what we've uncovered is a timeline that is richer, messier, and infinitely more human. We now see a full century of prologue, a hidden era of early contact where Romans and Britons weren't just adversaries on a battlefield, but were neighbors, business partners, and family members, building a blended world together long before the legions officially arrived. This transformation is profound. Roman Britain is no longer just a story of military conquest, imposed from the top down by emperors and generals. It has become a bottom-up story of cultural fusion, a slow, organic process of entanglement where economics, diplomacy, and personal relationships paved the way for political change. The real drama wasn't confined to the landing beaches of Kent. It was happening in the bustling marketplace of that Northamptonshire settlement, in the mixed households where a British-style pot sat next to a Roman amphora, and in the bonds forged between a Gallic auxiliary and a local chieftain's daughter. This discovery restores the voices of the pioneers, the traders, the veterans, the adventurers whose ambitious, risky endeavors created the foundation upon which an empire was later built. They were the true architects of Roman Britain, and their story, once erased by imperial propaganda, has now been resurrected from the earth, forcing us to replace a myth of glorious invasion with the reality of gradual, collaborative integration. And the most exciting part of all of this is the realization that this story is not finished. The ground beneath our feet, in fields, under cities, and across the landscape, is not a closed archive. It is a living library, and we have only just begun to read its shelves. The discovery in Northamptonshire is not the end of the search. It is the starting pistol for a new era of historical investigation. It gives archaeologists a new blueprint, a new set of questions to ask. They are now re-examining every odd coin, every strange building foundation, every anomalous artifact with fresh eyes, knowing that what was once dismissed as a fluke might now be a vital clue pointing to another lost community. The next great discovery that rewrites our past could be lying just a few feet below a modern housing estate, a shopping center, or a farmer's plow line, waiting for the right combination of curiosity and technology to bring its secrets back into the light. This is the powerful legacy of this find. It's an invitation for all of us to look at the history that surrounds us with a new sense of wonder and possibility. The grand narratives we take for granted, the stories that shape our national identities and our understanding of the world, are not fixed in stone. They are provisional, always subject to revision by a single, unexpected discovery. The next time you walk through the British countryside, or indeed any landscape with a deep human past, remember that the soil holds more than just dirt and stones. It holds lost worlds, forgotten chapters, and the silent testimonies of people whose lives can still reshape our own. History is not just something we read in a book. It is something we stand upon, a vast and mysterious tapestry whose most thrilling patterns may still be waiting to be revealed. The greatest story ever told might not be in a library. It might be right under your feet, patiently waiting for its moment to change everything we thought we knew.